Yeah, I sometimes joke, with the right research, I say you can see the future. And I strongly believe that. I see opportunities in play and technology and EdTech that I've never seen before because the research is so compelling.
Bonjour, welcome to Wide Walls. My name is Mathieu Penaud. I am a product manager and learning experience designer, passionate about education, technology, and creativity. In this podcast, I interview inspiring educators, researchers, and technologists to discuss their journey and insights as they imagine and build the future of learning. If you enjoyed the show, please follow Wide Walls on Substack or on your favorite podcast platform and share it with your friends and colleagues. Today, I am excited and honored to welcome Scott Traylor to Wide Walls. Scott brings a wealth of experience and knowledge in the edtech and toys industry. In 1996, he founded 360 Kid, providing interactive product development services to companies like Sasini Workshop, Pokemon, and Hasbro. His work earned 2 Toy of the Year nominations, 3 Emmy nominations, and 1 Emmy win. After 20 years running 360 Kid, Scott led innovative product teams at Encantos and Wonder Workshop, home of the beloved Dash and Dot robots, focusing on teaching kids 21st century skills and computational thinking through digital and physical play-based learning. Now, Scott is a strategy consultant, advisor, and mentor to multiple edtech and kidtech companies. I've first known him as the now former president of the San Francisco Bay Area chapter of the Children's Media Association, a fantastic community I'm grateful to be a part of. As a true lifelong learner, Scott recently joined the Learning Design, Innovation and Technology Master's Program at the Harvard School of Education, where he focuses on spatial cognition and learning. Scott explains in this conversation the importance of spatial cognition to predict success in STEM fields, along with insightful stories and research on the topic. He also shares his thoughts on the evolution of the toys and edtech landscape over the past decade, including an interesting concept that he calls Moore's Echo, as a reference to Moore's Law. I hope you enjoy the episode. Scott, thank you so much for joining us on Wide Walls. Welcome to the show.
Matthew, thank you so much for having me. Big fan of the show.
Thank you. Yeah, there's so many things that we're going to talk about today. I'm very excited. But first, we're going to start, as usual, with some rapid fire questions. And I'm going to start with, where did you grow up?
Oh, I grew up outside of Boston, a town called Westwood, lived there a long time, and then moved closer to Boston to a town called Newton, where my office, 360 Kid, was located for a long time. Before moving to the Bay Area and, living there just about a decade with a year in between in Los Angeles to work with LeVar Burton, which was an amazing ride, returning to the Bay for the EdTech that I love.
And now, I guess, back to Boston?
Back to Boston. Weather's already starting to get cold. I'm having PTSD about it, but I do miss the Bay.
What was your favorite toy as a kid?
Gosh, well, that's a great question. I mean, I had a lot of, construction kits, Tinker Toys, Lego, erector sets, a lot of things with electronics and motors. Those were always very appealing and exciting to me. I think I could say generally that category, which, as we talk about later, how it touches into spatial understanding. But, those play experiences were pretty formative for me in those early days.
And what would you say is your favorite toy today?
That's a very good question. I'm looking around. I am a toy collector, and this is a radio that I bought in Campbell about a decade ago. It's Italian made. I love the design and the shape of it. It's a hard to find product even at the time when it was selling. I keep it right here, along with some other fun toys, within arm's reach.
Because just to describe, it looks like a very old school, like radio toy.
It is. It's Italian. And, I have an industrial design background too. So that, the curves and the shapes and the colors, and, it's intended for, 4 to 6-year-old child. I love it. This Unimax toy company, makes some really beautifully designed toys that are simplistic in their shapes and colors. There are many others that I could probably point to. In fact, I've donated, in moving to California, I donated a large amount of my toy collection to the Strong Museum of Play in Rochester, New York. So you can actually see my collection of whatever I've given them through their website, as well as all of other people who have donated their products over the years.
Oh wow, wonderful. I'm jealous. I
It's
want to
fun.
visit.
It is fun. I mean, I love the toy space, and in particular, what I love about it is that you live and die by what you developed, invented, created, 6 months ago. That play is such a fast-moving, evolving space in the toy world, and I love it. I mean, I love technology in Silicon Valley too, but that tends to be a longer play that doesn't happen overnight usually. But the toy industry is constantly innovating and creating, and why I love it so much.
Who was your favorite teacher?
Oh, well, I've had many, and very fortunate. One was an art teacher when I was in high school that was very open-ended in exploring your creativity and how you would express yourself through art, be it 2D or 3D. I think of him all the time. I accidentally ran into him by accident once, which was such a trip. But he was a nonsense kind of artist, and if you weren't taking chances or risks, he'd come right in and draw on top of whatever you're working on. No, you need to do this. No, you need to do that. Well, wait a minute. Now you've kind of ruined it. It's like, no, I need you to do this. If you don't do it, I'm going to do it for you. Kind of like that tool, that writing tool, Type or Die, where if you don't write fast enough, it's going to start deleting what you've written. In a sense, he was forcing us to be bold and to take chances when we were creating.
I love that. Somehow it reminds me of something we did when I did like a workshop at the D school at Stanford, where we had like notebooks. And the first thing we did was trashing our notebooks, like
Yeah.
just trashing them so that we're not too attached to like the writing properly and.
Very funny. I mean, we have a similar thing at the Graduate School of Education at Harvard. We're keeping journals in some classes, and it's the ongoing kind of exploration of the design journey.
Nice. What is one thing that all kids should learn at school?
Well, I'm a big believer in play and more of it. And it's hard to say, is it play a thing you learn or you experience? I think it may be more on the experience side, but how it ripples and plays out through one's life, is very important and touches on so many things. Definitely, without a doubt, play. I hesitate to say any particular subject, although I'm a fan of the arts and I often promote that. But I imagine, like you probably follow a lot of play researchers and things written about play, and I'm a believer. And I think that is the area that should be spending as much time as you can as a young child, even an adult.
I agree. Actually, that's my next question, which is what is one thing that all adults should learn at work?
That's a very good question. It's funny, it depends on the context where you're working, but certainly, much like the art teacher experience I was telling you about, to be bold, to be fearless, to take chances and risks. But I say that with an asterisk, that not all businesses embrace that, which is a shame. I think the more you empower people in the workplace, the better work product you're going to get. I think it's a matter of trusting your employees to do the right thing. It's not about micromanaging at the executive level. That doesn't get you anywhere. It's about believing in your people and letting them do the best work they can.
Great. What is the latest thing you did for work?
The latest thing? I'm consulting with a few companies in Europe right now. One of them is a VR-based children's medical company in Berlin. And we're spending a lot of time talking about how best to deliver a VR experience to help mitigate the effects of myopia. It's pretty awesome. I love this company. They're doing amazing work. And thankfully, they found me, and it's been a wonderful ride.
What's the name of the company?
It's called Dopavision. They've learned some pretty amazing things about what kinds of wavelengths of light projected to the back of the eye can mitigate the effects of myopia. One of the interesting and somewhat sad things about, advances in technology and everyone having access to a screen is that myopia is on the rise, especially with children, as a result of, you know, spending maybe too much time with screens. So this is an issue globally. It's kind of surprising that more people aren't aware of it because it impacts a lot of children around the world.
Mm.
So this is something I'm really excited about working on.
Yeah, that sounds awesome.
Yeah.
And my last question, what is the latest thing you did to relax?
Well, listening to a lot of books as I'm walking to and from class. That's mostly the relaxing. There's a lot of late nights and early mornings. Hold on, I forget the title of the one that I'm reading right now. That is, it's called, I think it's called The Most Human Human. What is it about human characteristics that are unique to humans that AI can't mimic or that computing power
Oh.
can't duplicate?
Mm-hmm.
It's a fascinating read. It gets into a lot of heady stuff about having a soul and, what are things that computers aren't really good at communicating about. And, there's a lot of talk in this book about the Turing test and how there are, every year there are Turing tests to test out new computer systems to see if it can fool people as being actually human. It's given me a lot of pause to reflect on smaller things about being human that AI can't capture. So this is just one. I mean, I'm probably in between a handful of books right now, but that's the one that I'm currently in on.
This made me want to read it. It was a good, good pitch.
It's got some great stories in it.
Yeah, thank you, Scott, for answering all these rapid fire questions. And to start a conversation, I would love to hear from you. Like, how do you feel when you look at your journey?
Well, I mean, I'm thankful for the opportunities I've had. I mean, I've worked with some amazing companies and some amazing people. I'm very thankful for the opportunity. I give, a huge shout out to Sesame Workshop for getting me interested in research at a very early in my career. It's made a huge difference with everything I've done. To think about what literature should I bring to a project that may be able to help better guide its development. Thinking about research questions before, during, and after while you're building and while you're testing. And Sesame was a very early child tester organization with everything they did. And I was spoiled after work. I worked with them closely for about 8 years, and then when I went off to work with other companies, I go like, okay, where's the literature scan? What do we need to know to get started? And they go like, what are you talking about? I think it's a different day now. But to get back to your question, I'm very thankful. And what is interesting is when I look at the twists and turns that happen in the industry as AI right now is disrupting a lot of ideas, or just a couple of years ago was NFTs, and before that blockchain, and before that maker spaces, and before that STEM. There's a pendulum that swings, and there's always something new. And to be aware of those changes and how they will impact the work that you do. I think in the earlier part of my career, I just figured you just keep doing the same thing, but then something groundbreaking will happen, and you've got to work with it, stay agile and nimble, and ready to learn the latest and greatest thing.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting. And that kind of explains also like you going back to school as well to kind of deepen that knowledge about the topic that you're very excited about, which is spatial cognition.
Yeah, and there are a number of reasons that I went back to school. First, to pursue my learning product ideas in the spatial realm. Second, there are some professors that I was very excited to study with that I've known for years. And my fear would be that they'd retire before I had a chance to really study with them. And also, I think, let me call out transparently that this is a difficult time for EdTech right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's even more so in the Valley compared to the rest of the world. And that may be rather San Francisco centric of me. But when I think about how much technical talent has been laid off, how high interest rates are for venture to invest in new startups, and how there are no new, really comparatively to prior years, very few startups that are working in EdTech right now, it's a very challenging time that I don't see turning around for a little bit. So I was kind of hedging my bets when I applied to school, thinking, gosh, I hope the industry turns around. But if it doesn't, I'd rather be in school than struggling to find work. And I think, in saying that, I've been fortunate because, looking at ed tech through the lens of North America is one thing, but ed tech in Europe, ed tech in Singapore is an entirely different story. They're doing well. We're not doing well here in the US.
How would you explain that?
I think partly because of how, initiatives at government levels, differences in investor strategies, interest rates. I still see a lot of active venture work being done outside the US. I mean, it's still happening in the US as well in ed tech, but not to the level it used to be. And I've met some fabulous investors overseas that are very bullish in the ed tech space.
Yeah, I think I want to focus a little more right now first on the topic that you're
Sure.
looking at school, and then we'll expand towards a little more about that larger edtech landscape. But there's a term that I used when I presented you, and you mentioned it a few times, which is spatial cognition, and that I'm not sure everybody is really aware of what that means. And so, could you define what spatial cognition is?
Certainly. And in doing so, let me start off by saying, even within the spatial research community, there are different spatial domains. But where I'm looking mostly is one's ability to dynamically transform objects in the real world or mentally. Like one of the great abilities of spatial understanding is the ability to mentally rotate objects in one's mind. And that sounds kind of nerdy and wonky, but it is, a predictive talent of success in STEM and engineering, biology, chemistry. It's a foundational skill that is paid very little attention, through K-12. There's a lot of ways of thinking about, what is spatial cognition and spatial learning. And, it could be something like following instructions from an IKEA kit. It could be reading a map, or it could be perspective taking, like there's a tree across the street from me outside my window. Can I imagine standing under it, and what would I see? These are some of the different domains of spatial understanding as the researchers describe it today. But in fact, let's see here. I have this one hand drawn chart here of, the 2x2 grid that's often referred to in spatial understanding: static, dynamic, intrinsic, extrinsic. And I've written some things in here. The domain that matters most to me is dynamic and intrinsic. That's the mental rotation part, or being able to understand changes between objects, whether rotating, being cut, moving in relation to one another. That is the skill that is more predictive of success in STEM. And that's why I've gone back to school, to try to figure out what kind of learning materials could I make around that knowledge, around that area. There really isn't, for the most part, spatial curriculum that you could say, hey, here's my middle school spatial curriculum, and I think as educators start to learn more and more about what it means to include spatial understanding in learning, it's often slapped on top of something, usually mathematics, sometimes geometry, as Common Core and state standards touch on certain spatial elements, but it might be covered in an hour or less, and that's it over the lifetime of someone's K-12 experience. What is interesting in the research that I've learned is that, aside from the fact that there's a problem with the STEM pipeline from K-12 into university level and then to career, people who run STEM-related businesses are always crying out for more employees that are skilled in their field. But one of the predictors in freshman year of any STEM subject or engineering is one's ability to mentally rotate objects. And if that skill doesn't exist, that student is at risk for either dropping out or transferring into something that's non-STEM related. It's an easy thing to predict. There are assessments that you could do. And problem is that historically schools have relied on the SAT. I have this other chart I made here that in the middle is G, which stands for intelligence. And, the SATs is made up of math and verbal reasoning. And a lot of schools admit students to all kinds of different STEM-related programs based upon their SAT scores or their math and verbal reasoning scores. Whereas if they had done a very simple spatial assessment, it's a greater predictor of success in college and after graduation than looking at intelligence from a math and verbal reasoning perspective.
That's very interesting. Everyone listening right now, like they can just do a simple exercise, like look at an object and try to rotate it in their mind and try to see if they can visualize.
And let me bring this back to play where we were talking about. There's research also that says, well, what is it that is the difference between those who have strong spatial skills and those who don't? And there's a large amount of research that, in my opinion, is kind of conflicting, where the research will say that men have stronger spatial abilities than women. And some of them will even go on to say that that's innate, or that's genetic, or that's just biology, or that's just the nature of, gender differences. And I disagree. I think it's all about access. When you dig deeper about who else does not have strong spatial abilities, students from disadvantaged communities also have weak spatial skills. So some of the research that I'm excited about when I see it is children who have access to spatial play experiences, indoors or outdoors, construction kits, Lego, you name it, have stronger spatial abilities. And the problem with some spatial toys like construction toys, or even Lego for that matter, is they can be perceived through a gender lens where it's a boy thing. Thus, women who don't have access to it don't have access to those spatial experiences. Now, as it relates to students from underserved communities, their homes may not be able to afford those kind of play experiences. Therefore, they don't have access to those experiences and don't strengthen their spatial abilities. But it is something that can be taught at any age and improved at any age. It's not, there's no critical period to it, although there is certainly benefits to learning these spatial play opportunities at a young age, but they can be learned at any age.
And what kind of activities can be intentionally, I understand how certain forms of play, of experiences will naturally grow that spatial cognition ability. But is there some intentional activities that are really targeted towards, that could be part of like a curriculum or something that would be targeted?
There are a handful of things you can do. Aside from, as I'm saying, like, access to maker kind of things, or construction toys, or Lego. Sports has an embodied cognition component to it that is spatial. So does dance, any physical kind of movement. And for families that may not be able to access those kind of play experiences, language is an important way to communicate spatial understanding as well. For example, I could say, on the table there, is the plate on top of the placeholder, or is it beside it? Is it under it or above it? Or is it beyond? The words that you choose to describe objects next to each other, just the language alone has a great benefit to growing a spatial understanding. And there's some great research out there. And I believe Kathy Hirsch-Pasek and Roberta Galinkoff have done some work in this area as well, in addition to all the plays, things that we love to read about from them, about being very intentional in your language, in talking about objects in relationship to each other, that if you don't have access to the play opportunities, you could be more aware of the language you're using with children.
Yeah, that's super interesting.
Yeah.
And how do you see that translating, so that research and those findings translating into outside of school, like products, EdTech products, or EdTech solutions, or toys maybe, that really dig on this research?
Yes. I would say, there are plenty of play experiences that are accidentally spatial from a learning perspective. I don't think toy inventors or anyone involved in developing play experiences think from the beginning, how can I make this more spatial? I think what's more important to think about is, how do I make this more novel so it's engaging? For myself right now, I'm working on a variety of spatial products. One of them's in VR. Another one's related to a business idea at the college level for spatial understanding. But at the same time, You may have heard of this theory called the test effect, that if you take a test, just simply taking the test will make you better in whatever that subject is. So the same is true with spatial assessments. You know what? I have a printout. I just happened to be talking with somebody about this particular assessment, which is the mental rotations assessment by Vanderberg and Hughes, where you're rotating different objects mentally and you need to figure out, are they the same object rotated or are they a mirrored image? Just by taking that test alone, you improve your spatial skills. And I have this theory that if you can deconstruct a spatial assessment and turn it more into a playful puzzle-like experience, could you improve your skills that way? In one of my classes right now, the one that we were talking about related to journal keeping, I'm working on a puzzle book right now, kind of, the pieces of a manuscript. And there are a number of books that I have planned, but the first one is related to block counting, which on the front here may look familiar. You may see some of this stuff, in middle school math, where the object is to count how many blocks there are. But the challenge becomes when they're hidden. Like there are blocks behind there. And do I have another? I think I have
So
another.
just to explain, we're looking at some structure, like 3D structures made of blocks.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. And I loved those kind of puzzles when I was younger. And I didn't even know they were spatially minded. So I thought, like, well, when you see that unit rolled out in mathematics, they don't get more complicated than that. I'm talking about doing something like this.
Oh, wow. So
Something
now
much,
we're looking,
something that,
at a very big structure.
that's right. And there are some problems with some of the early designs I've come up with that I won't get into, but that I'm implementing and iterating on right now with this puzzle book that I'm creating. But some of the elements of spatial understanding are volumetric thinking and logical deduction, and there's a pattern recognition. These are all elements that touch on spatial learning, and so I am deconstructing these assessments and turning them into puzzles that could be very helpful for increasing one's spatial ability.
Yeah, it's definitely the kind of puzzle that I do enjoy doing as well. But I could imagine someone who has less like spatial cognition ability that will feel very frustrated at this kind of
Yes. Yep.
challenges. So I wonder, like, how do you ease it in?
It's a good point, and that's some of the feedback that I have right now. I think because I'm starting at such a high level, just to kind of entertain myself, if you will, that I may unintentionally be creating a barrier for those who are struggling with spatial skills that may not have it but are interested in improving it. So right now, I'm looking at the puzzles that I'm making. There may be a scaffolded approach where they would be much more accessible and simple to start with. If it could be leveled up over time. The ones that I'm making right now are much more along the lines of thinking, instead of doing a Sunday New York Times crossword puzzle, would you want to do one of these instead? Because it'll probably take you about just as long. That was, the end goal. But then realizing and focusing on that end product, that there are many steps in between for those who are struggling to get there. And so that's what I'm focusing on now for the next week or two, on the scaffolded approach. And also offering, tips for understanding, where are those pesky hidden blocks that you can't see, and exploding them out. And this is not me as a puzzle maker trying to fool you, but I'm trying for you to use your reasons of deduction to figure out what's missing.
Got it. Yeah, no, that's super interesting. And I want to kind of expand a little more on VR as well, because that's definitely another element where, I mean, there's been a lot of talk about VR, and there's been the Apple Vision
Yeah.
Pro recently, and so, but somehow it has not really taken off in ways that we might have expected like some years ago.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering, like, how do you look at VR as a tool that is feels definitely aligned with your objectives of
Yeah.
practicing and learning spatial cognition?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And I know we haven't talked about this, but one of the great things about going back to school is I also have access to classes at MIT. So I'm taking classes at MIT as well. And one of them is designing virtual worlds where, I'm designing experiences for VR headsets. I had just wrote a paper about where we are in VR's history, in my opinion, that I still feel it's very early days. Like, I don't even think we've found the equivalent of our 3 camera shoot in television yet. For those, media history buffs, that was a groundbreaking moment in television. And while I'm told it was not invented by Desi Arnaz of I Love Lucy, it was first really taken advantage of, and one of the many reasons why that show took off in the early days of television. And I keep asking myself, where's our 3 camera shoot for VR, right? Let me tell you briefly about a project I'm working on right now that is pretty mind blowing. That I'm thinking about assessments and spatial assessments in 3D. And I'm working with a team of students on a project that's related to a nonprofit organization called Project Prakash, Prakash. And Project Prakash is a nonprofit that is trying to bring sight to blind children in India. The interesting thing about, this visual impairment for everyone in the world, for those that are blind, about 25% of all cases of blindness are in India. And most of the issues related to blindness for children in that country are curable, but it's an issue of being able to pay for surgery to remove cataracts or some other minor thing that is causing the blindness. So there is a professor at MIT, Dr. Pawan Sinha, who has observed that once children regain their eyesight, that doesn't necessarily mean that they see and understand objects in the real world. So, we who are sighted can touch an object, a sphere or a cube, know what that is mentally, and also see it in the real world. And there's been this scientific challenge that goes along like this. If a person is born blind and has never seen before, and they can feel a sphere and a cube, and then gain their sight, would they recognize that sphere and cube in the real world? It was a question that had been remained unanswered for 300 years until recently through this work, through Project Prakash. And the answer is no. Blind children who regain their sight can't recognize these objects in the real world, at least for the first many weeks, few months, as they're getting reacquainted to, or getting acquainted to, what it means to have vision.
Wow.
So we're working on a project that has a number of visual assessments in it and learning games in it, to try to introduce the concepts of recognizing objects in a 3-dimensional space through VR, as opposed to the real world, because there's too much stimulus going on in the real world. We're trying to mask out a lot of the distraction in the learning of how to see again. And, when I got involved in this project, I didn't realize how much of a spatial connection there really was to this. But there's a huge connection. And, the research in the area is just starting to take off about how we learn as humans to see, and what are the processes, behind vision, what's going on in our brain and mentally for us to make sense of objects. So that's what I'm working on right now. We're working on game-based assessments for people who have just regained their vision. There may be a component where we're using a 3D VR glove that I'm actually building one right now in my spare time. Like, I need that on top of everything else I'm doing. But there's none available at MIT right now. So they say you just have to build your own. That's the way it's done. It's like, okay, I'll do that. But it's quite the journey. I'm pretty excited about it. And I'm looking forward to, being able to have access to more VR classes at MIT as part of my journey and coming back to school.
Well, that's I didn't know anything about all the topic you talked about. I found it like fascinating.
It's
Brain connection between
yeah.
vision and the.
I knew nothing about it. I've now written a handful of papers on it after being exposed to it. And it looks like an amazing opportunity to be part of some real groundbreaking science.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good actually segue talking about VR and the evolution of VR and where we are. You have an extensive experience of observing the toy industry and the tech industry kind of evolve. And I'm very curious to talk about like what are some trends, high level trends you've observed like over the years, over maybe the past decade?
Well, I mean, some changes that are noteworthy, and they're not VR specific; they are more EdTech specific.
Hmm.
One I touched on earlier, that I think there's a greater desire to understand the research, to know how people have struggled before, and to find insights through research. Yeah, I sometimes joke, with the right research, I say you can see the future, and I strongly believe that. I don't know if you're familiar with IDC, the Interactive Design Conference that's part of ACM.
Yes.
Whenever I go to those events, I go like, I see the future. I see opportunities in play and technology and ed tech that I've never seen before, because the research is so compelling. I guess I'm a research nerd in that regard. So it's wonderful to see how the industry has paid more attention to research and even hired in-house UX researchers, for example. The whole field of UX is a change. Long term, looking back, it used to be called interface design,
Hmm.
and interface design and user experience have an overlap, but there are differences as well that are very meaningful on the UX side. I love the fact that the field is embracing UX, and I imagine if the toy industry is not doing it already, they probably are thinking very deeply about it. And that's also an area in VR that I think is most challenging. What are the interfaces that are intuitive to use to interact with whatever's in your environment?
Yeah.
I think that's a very ripe area for experimentation and exploration. So, those are the things that I've been excited about in my journey, to see how important research has played a part.
Hmm.
And I'm sure, like you, like me, we share a lot of the same research friends, and they're all working on super cool things, and that wouldn't have happened 10 years ago unless you were working at Sesame.
Yeah, no, that's true. That's true. And I'm curious because when you say looking at this research, I can see the future. But like, what do you see? Like, what do you think the space is going to look like in, I don't know, 5 years, 10 years from now?
You know, I think there's no other surefire way of something not to happen than to try to predict it. So whatever I predict here is most likely not going to happen. I've talked about you know embedded computing experiences where we're not walking around with devices, but let's talk about smart walls or smart rooms.
Mm,
I've always thought that might be a future. And as electronics and components and the things we carry along get smaller and smaller, that could be. I hesitate to say that VR is the future in play. I think AR may be first before VR. I'm very bullish on AR, but I'm also more concerned about those experiences in a child's life. I imagine, being at Stanford yourself, you're probably familiar with the V Lab, the VR lab that Jeremy Bailenson runs. And he'll say, for anyone, not just kids, but it's like, there's a time limit that you should not be wearing a headset all day long. You should not be wearing a headset for an hour. And if you're wearing it for long periods of time, you need to take breaks. And I think there is not much thought around what does it mean to have a screen 1 inch from your eyes for an extended
mm,
period of time. That's an area that we just haven't spent enough time researching. And so, what, you're going to give your child a headset to wear all day without this information really being known?
yeah.
So I'm a bit more cautious. I'm optimistic about the possibilities, but I don't see the future of play being that. It's so hard to predict what's going to be popular year after year just in the toy world. And usually it's the things that you would never expect,
Yeah.
combining odd things together to create this amazing novel experience.
Yeah, and just for people who are not necessarily familiar with the terms VR and AR,
Oh,
so yeah, VR is virtual reality when you have a headset and you're fully immersed into the headset, so you don't see what's
yep.
around you. Um, and AR is augmented reality where you superpose
You,
um,
you have
like
pass through. You can
things,
see through
yeah,
the device.
into
Yeah,
into the real world.
that's right. A little bit more like what the Apple VR headset is like. I mean, that is you can see through into the real
Mm,
world. And then there's also XR, which is mixed reality, where it's a blend between what the real world is and a fantasy imaginary world on top of it. It's amazing. I remember the early days of the web where you could see day after day amazing things happen online, and then the evolution of the web. Web 1.0, 2.0, 3.0, and creative abilities. Web 3 thinking right now is pretty amazing. But we're not. I don't think we're at that point yet with other kinds of XR related experiences.
mm.
I love what Apple's been doing about spatial computing, but I ask myself, is it needed? Do I need a $3,000 headset to be able to do the same thing I can do with all my monitors I have set up right here?
So that's a fair question. And I'm curious, like on the side of toys, with all the digitalization that happens, how do you see the future for like the tangible, like basic toys that we all know, like Lego and dolls and like all these just,
Yeah,
I would call like simple toys, even though they're not necessarily like simple because they open like so many pathways for
yeah.
play and exploration. Yeah. How do you see the future of that?
There's certainly huge opportunity for technology and play, but I'm not a fan of technology for technology's sake.
Hmm.
There has to be a compelling reason why. And I was working on this article recently that I haven't published yet, but it might be worth talking about because it talks about the differences between startups startups in Silicon Valley versus the toy industry and how often think about things and trying to be innovative. And I think startups in Silicon Valley are very hyper focused about what the latest technology is, and they will try to define businesses around that. And that's leading with technology, and it's not necessarily answering a problem,
Hmm.
although sometimes some companies get lucky and do solve a problem with a cutting edge, bleeding edge technology. But a lot of the process of running fast and breaking things with new technologies is it's often a question looking for an answer, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you could probably, without trying too hard, think of a number of startups as like, what problem are they solving here? Whereas in the toy industry, like I mentioned, they live and die by innovation and novelty, but they rarely use cutting edge technology to make their products.
Mm.
They'll often look to what was popular technology 10 or 15 or 20 years ago. And I call this Moore's Echo. And, I'm not looking to get in a big argument about Moore's Law existing today, even though some people think it is. And I say, no, it's not. It doesn't exist anymore. But the concept of Moore's Law, that things are constantly advancing and improving in 18-month increments, is one way of looking at technology as a whole, despite the chipset argument. But Moore's Echo is, something I've coined about looking at technologies from yesteryear that still have the potential to be engaging and meaningful and playful. And the toy industry lives and dies by whatever fractions of a penny they can make on their product. It's very hard to make a technology toy be compelling if the components are very expensive, whereas components from yesteryear are not. And so it's funny when you get under the hood of a popular technology product, you go like, wow, look at that really old chip there. Or look at what they did there. That's so old school. But it's brilliant in how they reimagine an old technology to work for a playful experience. So this was something I was working on, thinking like, there's a spectrum, if you will.
Yeah.
The Moore's Law people over here and the Moore's Echo people over here. It's worth being aware of because it's so hard to make a profit on anything you do that's a technology product. It's really, really hard.
Yeah.
Um, just the
Yeah.
the idea that I pull out of the idea box that I share with others.
Yeah, and the margin, yeah, the margins are so tiny in the toy industry.
It's so tiny.
That's yeah.
Yeah.
And I was wondering, so you did teach at Harvard from 95 to 2006, so like
Yep.
11 years.
11, almost
Yeah.
12 years. Yeah. It was a computer science class for graduate students on making interactive experiences for children. I think when I started teaching there, I was teaching kind of general purpose interactive design. And while there's an element of interest there, I lost interest in it pretty quickly. And I worked with a wonderful professor at the computer science school named Henry Leitner, who said, "Well, what is it you like to do?" And I said, "I like to make products for kids." And he said, "Well, teach that, do that." And so, I mean, he just gave me a gift. It's like I reinvented the class to be all about making products for children. And it was wonderful. I loved it. I mean, as much as I enjoyed teaching, I also learned so much more from the students, as is any teacher will tell you, that there is huge value in working with others and teaching them, because you are also a student as well, working with them.
And it was 20 years ago, and I'm wondering, how would that class be different if you were teaching it today?
Oh,
Why would be different?
what's funny is I'd probably start off talking about agile,
Hmm.
the differences between waterfall and agile. That was not a concern when I was teaching. It was all waterfall. But at the same time, knowing when to bring agile into the picture and when not to, that, everything doesn't need agile. It's just the things that are unanswerable, I think, in my opinion, need agile. So I'd probably spend more time in the early days of my course doing that.
And could you can you just define quickly
Describe what
waterfall
that
versus
is.
agile?
Sure.
What
So,
would
well, first, let me talk like the way products historically would be built in a waterfall method, alpha,
Mhm.
beta periods, RC. There's a design document, a technical document, a technical spec that you build from, that you don't really deviate from. You're building to a spec. And, in the early days of building, you release an alpha version that is, gosh, it's been a while since I've even talked about this, that is code incomplete, art incomplete with bugs to resolve. You move into beta and it's code complete, art complete with bugs to resolve. And by the time you get to RC, everything is resolved, but you're just fine tuning. The problem with waterfall is that there are some things you can't know that you define on paper ahead of time with very challenging, complex technologies. So what agile offers you is, you may have a starting point, you may have a design document, you may have technical specs, but there are holes in it that you need to fill in. So the agile process is about working in particular increments of time, usually 2 weeks. So it could be 1 week, it could be a month long, and you define what you think are the elements that need to be worked on as individual tasks, and then you assign them to a team member and you estimate their effort, and you work on it over the period of usually 2 weeks. And then you have a review with your team and you see if it's working or not. And is it informative enough to help with other elements that haven't been defined yet? And so in the next 2 week sprint, these periods are called sprints, you try to solve the next problem, the next unknown. But the goal of Agile is to have functioning, working products or prototypes by the end of that sprint. That you need to have an increment of value to what your effort is contributing towards. It needs to be, substantial in that period of time. And so there's a lot of trade-offs in how you approach things like that. If you have 30 things on your list to do, you need to prioritize them, you need to size them, and what kind of bucket would they fit into, and how will they inform other things that you don't know down the road. That's a very different approach to development today compared to when I was teaching. But I would also be bringing out more research, more UX research.
Hmm.
I'd probably spend at least half the class talking about UX design compared to what I used to do. I mean, I spent a lot of time talking about interface design in a day gone by, but there's so much more to think about the experience today than there was before.
I would take that class.
I would love you to be there. I'd make you a guest lecturer a few times too.
Awesome. Yeah, that was a fascinating conversation, and I learned so much. we're getting towards the end, but I have a question that I always like to ask, and I'm curious what your answer will be. Which is if you could design a school around one thing, and it can be a concept, it can be something physical, it can be anything, what would it be and why?
Well, I mean, wrapping up the way we started off, that it would be play based.
Hmm.
Um, I think a lot of people might be surprised to hear me say that because, like, well, wouldn't you make a spatial school? It's like, well, I don't think there needs to be a school for it. I think there needs to be attention to spatial learning, but it doesn't need to be for 12 grades. It may not even need to be more than 6 months. But play is such an important component to everything I think I've done and everything that you do, I'm sure. And its value is huge. I'm not a fan of tightly scripted curriculum on an instructional path that it doesn't vary at all. I'm all for the messy.
Mm.
I want to see the playfulness and the experimentation. I want to see opportunities for failure. Failure needs to be part of that school in such a way that it is not something that is looked down upon. It is
Hmm.
looked upon as a badge of honor, that while you failed, you are now one step closer to not failing. This is how I really wish schools would pay more attention to that. And I'm a big experiential learner person. I've worked with a nonprofit organization that's very big into experiential learning. That it's part of my DNA with everything I do. So I would love to see that kind of school built, or that kind of program institutionalized across the country.
Love it. Well, thank you so much, Scott. Where can people like find more information about you, your research, your work?
Well, that's funny. I mean, my blogs that I have online are a little dated these days, which is why I'm writing a lot, but I haven't published yet. I'm thinking I'll be sharing more and more on my LinkedIn profile. I connect with folks in the industry. I do ask that I see some people that I know in their connections list before connecting to them. I'm looking for other like-minded people, either in the ed tech space or in adjacent spaces that are trying to answer the same kind of questions. I mean, it could be adult learning, it could be physical therapy, it could be anything adjacent to learning. Very interested in connecting with folks like that. So stay tuned to what's happening on my LinkedIn profile. That's usually where I share the most stuff.
Perfect.
Matthew, thank you very much for the opportunity. If anybody has interests or questions and want to reach out to me, certainly share my email address, DM me through LinkedIn. I live in LinkedIn, and love to keep the conversation going.
Sounds good. I will do. Thank you so much, Scott.
Thank you, Matthew.
Bye.
Bye bye.